the deep, velvet silence of the night, where the shadows breathe and the stars seem to hold their breath, there is a place hidden from the warmth of the sun. A place where the cold whispers of ancient things dance upon the wind, and the very air is thick with the secrets of the long forgotten. You've come here to this darkened corner of the world where time itself bends and twists, where the trees hold memories of blood and sorrow, and the earth drinks deep of despair. It is a place where nightmares are born, where they take shape and walk among us, unseen, unheard until it's too late. Listen closely now, as we step into the shadows, where the veil between worlds is thin, and the creatures of the night stir from their slumber. Tonight, I will take you to a secluded village, nestled in the heart of an ancient, brooding forest. Here, beneath the towering trees and the heavy shroud of night, lies a story as old as the bones of the earth itself, a story of temptation, of sacrifice, and of a love so fierce it could burn through the darkest of curses. But beware, for this tale is not for the faint of heart. It is a story of dark desires and the price one must pay when they dance with the shadows. Come closer if you dare, and let Mooncat guide you into the heart of the night, where the vampiric Frau Goden waits for those brave or foolish enough to cross her path. Before we descend fully into the shadows, a small request, dear listener. If you find yourself drawn to these tales of darkness and desire, if the whisper of the night calls to you as it does to me, then do not forget to subscribe to this channel. Let your curiosity feed the flames and leave a like as a token of your journey into the unknown. For in this realm, where stories come alive and the night is eternal, your presence is the only light we cherish. So join us and together we shall wander through the deepest of shadows, where mystery and magic intertwine. And remember, once you enter, there may be no turning back. The village of Weisenberg lay nestled in a forgotten corner of the Black Forest, its cobblestone streets winding through thick groves of ancient oaks and pines that seemed to whisper secrets older than time itself. The air was dense with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and as the sun dipped behind the jagged mountains that framed the horizon, a shroud of mist descended, cloaking the village in a veil of silence. It was a place where time had ceased to move forward, where the past lingered in every shadow, and where the darkness seemed to breathe with a life of its own. Johann had lived in Weisenberg his entire life, his days filled with the monotonous toil of tending his father's farm, his nights spent in the dim, flickering light of their hearth, where stories of the old world were whispered in hushed tones. The villagers spoke of the forest with reverence and fear, for it was said to be the domain of Frau Goden, a spectral figure who haunted the dreams of those she desired, luring them into her cold embrace with promises of eternal life. The stories had always seemed like mere folklore to Johann, the superstitions of a people isolated from the world, their minds clouded by the shadows that loomed over their lives. But then, One night, as he lay in his narrow bed, the boundary between myth and reality began to blur. It started with a dream, as these things often do. In the dream, Johann found himself wandering through the forest, the trees towering above him like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to reach for him with bony fingers. The air was thick with fog, obscuring his path and muffling his footsteps, but he felt an irresistible pull drawing him deeper into the woods, as if some unseen force was guiding him towards a destination unknown. The ground beneath his feet was soft, almost spongy, and the silence was so profound that he could hear the blood pounding in his ears. And then, as he rounded a bend in the path, he saw her. Frau Goden stood in a small clearing, her back turned to him, her long, flowing hair a cascade of raven black that shimmered in the pale light of the moon. She was clothed in a gown of deep crimson, the colour of blood, and her presence filled the air with a palpable sense of dread and awe. Johann froze, his breath caught in his throat, unable to move or speak, as she slowly turned to face him. Her face was a study in contrasts, a masterpiece of ethereal beauty marred by a darkness that lurked just beneath the surface. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, as if she were carved from the finest marble, and her eyes were a deep, hypnotic shade of green, flecked with gold, that seemed to pierce through his very soul. Her lips, full and blood red, curled into a smile that was both seductive and chilling, as she extended a hand towards him. "Come to me, Johann," she whispered, her voice like the rustling of leaves in the wind, soft and insistent. "I have waited so long for you." Johann felt himself drawn to her, his body moving of its own accord, his mind clouded with a strange, intoxicating desire. He knew he should be afraid, that he should turn and run as fast as he could, but the pull of her presence was too strong, the promise of eternal life too tempting to resist. He reached out to take her hand, his fingers brushing against hers, and the touch sent a shiver of icy pleasure down his spine. But just as their hands were about to entwine, Johann was jolted awake, his heart pounding in his chest, his body drenched in cold sweat. He lay there for a moment, his breath coming in ragged gasps, trying to convince himself that it had all been just a dream. But the memory of her touch lingered, as real and vivid as the night itself. The dream returned the next night, and the night after that, each time more vivid and more terrifying than the last. Johann found himself unable to sleep, fearing the moment when he would once again be drawn into the dark embrace of Frau Goden. But with each passing night, the desire to surrender to her grew stronger, the temptation to let go of his mortal life and join her in the shadows becoming almost unbearable. He began to withdraw from the village, avoiding the company of his friends and family, his mind consumed by thoughts of her. He would spend hours walking in the forest, hoping to catch a glimpse of her in the waking world, to feel her presence in the cool, damp air that clung to the trees. But the forest remained silent, as if holding its breath, waiting for the moment when he would finally give in to the darkness. As the days turned into weeks, Johann's health began to deteriorate. His skin grew pale, his eyes hollow, and he could barely muster the strength to tend to the farm. The villagers noticed the change in him, whispering among themselves that he had been cursed, that Frau Goden had marked him as her own. They spoke of other men, long dead, who had been seduced by the vampiric spirit, their bodies found lifeless in the forest, drained of blood, their souls forever lost to the darkness. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the village, Johann made his decision. He could no longer resist the call of Frau Goden, could no longer fight the yearning that had consumed his soul. He would go to her, surrender to her, and let her take him into the eternal night. He left the farmhouse without a word, his footsteps silent on the cobblestones as he made his way towards the forest. The village was quiet, the streets deserted, as if the very air had stilled in anticipation of what was to come. Johann felt a strange sense of calm wash over him as he entered the woods, the trees closing in around him like a shroud, their branches forming a dark canopy that blocked out the stars. He walked for what felt like hours, his mind blank, his body moving with a purpose that was not his own. And then, just as he began to doubt his resolve, he saw her. Frau Goden stood in the same clearing as before, her eyes gleaming in the darkness, her smile as cold and inviting as the grave. She held out her hand to him, and this time he did not hesitate. He stepped forward, his heart racing with a mixture of fear and anticipation, and took her hand in his. The moment their fingers touched, Johann felt a surge of cold energy flow through him, a sensation both exhilarating and terrifying. It was as if the very life was being drained from his body, replaced by something darker, something ancient and powerful. He could feel his soul slipping away, swallowed by the void that existed behind her eyes, and he welcomed it, craving the oblivion that awaited him. But just as he was about to be consumed, a voice called out from the darkness, breaking the spell. Johann, no. The voice was familiar, warm, and filled with desperation. It was his sister, Lies, the only family he had left. She had followed him into the forest, driven by a sense of dread that had settled over her like a storm cloud. She burst into the clearing, her face pale with fear, her eyes wide with horror, as she saw her brother standing on the precipice of damnation. "Don't do this, Johann," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "Come back to us. Come back to me." For a moment, Johann wavered, torn between the seductive pull of Frau Goden and the love he had for his sister. He could see the tears in her eyes, the pain etched into her face, and it cut through the fog that had clouded his mind. He tried to pull away from Frau Goden, to free himself from her grasp, but her fingers tightened around his, her eyes flashing with anger and hunger. "Leave us, child," she hissed, her voice no longer soft and inviting, but sharp and filled with malice. "He is mine now." But Lies would not be deterred. She stepped forward, her hands clasped together in a prayer, and began to recite the old words, the ones their mother had taught them when they were children, the words of protection against the darkness that lurked in the shadows. "Frau Goden, I command you, by the power of the light, release my brother and return to the night." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and charged with power, and for the first time Johann saw a flicker of fear in Frau Goden's eyes. She let out a low guttural growl, her grip on Johann's hand loosening as the power of the prayer pushed her back, inch by inch, into the shadows. "Johann, come to me," Lies cried, reaching out to him, with tears streaming down her face. "Come home." With a final, desperate surge of will, Johann broke free from Frau Goden's grasp, stumbling back into his sister's arms. The moment he did, the darkness that had clung to him like a second skin dissipated, leaving him weak and trembling, but alive. Frau Goden let out a scream of rage and frustration, her form dissolving into the mist as the light of dawn began to filter through the trees. The fog lifted, the air grew warmer, and the birds began to sing, as if the forest itself was relieved to be rid of her presence. Johann collapsed into Lice's arms, his body racked with sobs, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the reality of what had nearly happened began to sink in. Lice held him close, her arms wrapped tightly around him, her own tears mingling with his, as they both trembled in the aftermath of the encounter. For a long time they stayed like that, the silence of the forest broken only by the soft rustling of leaves and the distant call of a lone owl. The fear that had gripped Johann slowly began to ebb away, replaced by an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. His limbs felt heavy, as though every ounce of strength had been drained from his body, leaving him hollow and weak. But even in his weakened state, he felt a small glimmer of hope. Lies had saved him, had pulled him back from the edge of darkness, and for that he was infinitely grateful. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible, his head resting against his sister's shoulder. "Thank you for saving me." Lies stroked his hair, her voice soothing and gentle, as she replied, "You're safe now, Johann. She can't hurt you anymore." But even as she spoke the words, there was an unspoken fear in her heart, a fear that Johann's brush with the darkness had left a mark on him, one that would never fully fade. She had heard the stories, had listened to the whispers of the villagers, and she knew that those who were touched by Frau Goden were never truly free. The darkness had a way of clinging to its victims, a shadow that lingered in the soul, waiting for the right moment to return. They made their way back to the village as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting long, golden rays through the trees. The village was still and quiet, the houses dark and empty, as if the world itself had been holding its breath, waiting for their return. Johann leaned heavily on lies, his legs trembling with every step, but he forced himself to keep moving, determined to put as much distance between himself and the forest as possible. When they reached the farmhouse, Lies helped Johann inside, guiding him to the small bed that had been his since childhood. She pulled the covers up around him, her movements gentle and careful, as if he were a fragile, broken thing that needed mending. "Rest now, Johann," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet strength. "I'll stay with you." Johann nodded, too exhausted to speak, and closed his eyes, hoping that sleep would come and bring with it some measure of peace. But even as he drifted off, his mind was plagued by fleeting images of Frau Goden, her pale, haunting beauty, the icy grip of her hand, and the cold, dark promise that had whispered through his soul. The following days passed in a blur for Johann, his body slowly recovering from the ordeal, but his mind haunted by the memory of what had transpired. The villagers came by, offering their support and concern, their eyes filled with pity and fear. They whispered among themselves, their voices hushed but filled with the weight of the old stories, the tales of those who had been marked by Frau Goden and never fully returned to the world of the living. Lies stayed by his side, her presence a constant source of comfort, but even she could not banish the darkness that had settled over Johann's heart. He found himself withdrawing further into himself, his thoughts consumed by the memory of that fateful night. He could still feel the pull of Frau Goden, the seductive promise of eternal life that had nearly claimed him, and it filled him with a deep, gnawing fear of fear that he could not escape. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains and the shadows grew long, Johann found himself standing at the edge of the forest once more. The air was cool, the scent of pine and earth heavy in his nostrils, and the trees loomed before him like a wall of darkness, impenetrable and foreboding. He knew he should turn back, return to the safety of the farmhouse, but something held him there, rooted to the spot. He could feel her presence, just beyond the line of trees, waiting for him in the shadows. The fear that had gripped him was still there, but it was tempered by something else, an inexplicable longing, a yearning to see her again, to feel her cold touch, and hear her whispered promises. Johann, a voice called softly, breaking through his thoughts. It was Lies, standing a few feet behind him, her face pale and drawn with worry. "What are you doing out here?" "I don't know," Johann replied, his voice distant, as if coming from somewhere far away. I just needed to see." Lies stepped closer, her hand resting gently on his arm. "You don't have to go back there, Johann. She can't touch you anymore. But Johann wasn't so sure. The pull of Frau Goden was stronger than he wanted to admit, and he feared that one day it would be too much for him to resist. He turned to Lies, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. "What if she comes back?" he asked, his voice trembling. "What if she finds a way to take me, no matter what I do?" Lies looked at him, her eyes filled with compassion and a steely resolve. "Then we'll face her together, Johann. You're not alone. As long as we stand together, she can't have you." Johann wanted to believe her, to trust that the bond they shared would be enough to keep the darkness at bay. But deep down, he knew that Frau Goden was not a force to be easily defeated. She was ancient, powerful, and patient. And she had marked him of that. He was certain. The days turned into weeks, and though Johann did his best to return to his old life, the shadow of Frau Goden hung over him like a dark cloud. He threw himself into his work, trying to keep his mind occupied, but the nights were the worst. Every time he closed his eyes, he could feel her waiting for him in the darkness, her cold, pale hand reaching out, her whispered promises echoing in his mind. Lays continued to stay by his side, her presence a constant reminder that he was not alone, that even she could see the toll the ordeal had taken on him. His once vibrant spirit had been dulled, his eyes haunted by memories he could not escape. And as the leaves began to fall, and the chill of winter crept into the air, the villagers began to speak of Johann with pity and fear, their whispers filled with the old stories of those who had been touched by Frau Goden. One cold, moonlit night, as the first snowflakes began to fall, Johann woke with a start, his heart pounding in his chest. The farmhouse was silent, the only sound the faint crackling of the fire in the hearth. But there was something else, something just beyond the edge of hearing, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper that sent a chill down his spine. "Johann." When he sat up in bed, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps, his eyes wide with fear. The voice was unmistakable. It was Frau Goden, calling to him from the shadows, her voice filled with the same dark promise that had nearly claimed him before. "Johann, come to me." The voice was closer now, more insistent, and Johann felt a familiar pull deep within him, a longing to see her again, to surrender to her dark embrace. He knew he should resist, should fight the temptation, but the fear and desire that warred within him were too strong, too overwhelming. He rose from the bed, his movements slow and deliberate, as if in a trance. The house was cold, the fire barely more than embers, casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. Johann made his way to the door, his hand trembling as he reached for the latch. He hesitated for a moment, his mind screaming at him to stop, to turn back, but the pull of Frau Goden was too strong. As he stepped outside, the cold night air bit into his skin. the snow crunching underfoot as he made his way towards the forest. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale, eerie light over the landscape, and the trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with snow. Johann felt her presence before he saw her, the familiar, cold energy that sent shivers down his spine. She stood at the edge of the forest, her dark form barely visible against the shadows, her eyes glowing with a pale, otherworldly light. "Johann," she whispered, her voice like a caress. "You came back to me." He stopped a few feet away from her, his heart pounding in his chest, his breath visible in the cold night air. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to run, to flee from the darkness that threatened to consume him, but his feet were rooted to the spot, his mind clouded by the same intoxicating desire that had nearly claimed him before. "I knew you would come," Frau Goden continued, her voice soft and soothing. "You can't resist me, Johann. You belong to me." Johann swallowed hard, his throat dry, his voice barely more than a whisper as he replied, I can't go with you." Frau Goden smiled, a cold, chilling smile that sent a wave of dread through him. "Oh, but you can, Johann. You've already taken the first step. All you have to do is surrender, to let go of your fear, and I will give you everything you've ever dreamed of. Eternal life, endless nights of pleasure, power beyond your wildest imaginings. You will never grow old, never suffer, never be alone again. You will be mine, and I will be yours." Her words washed over Johann like a dark tide, pulling him deeper into the abyss. He could see it in his mind's eye, the endless nights of passion, the power that would course through his veins, the freedom from the mundane drudgeries of mortal life. The idea of never again feeling the weight of time, of escaping the inevitable decay of his body, was almost too seductive to resist. But then he thought of Lies, of her tear-streaked face, and the fierce determination in her eyes as she pulled him back from the brink. He thought of the warmth of the hearth, the smell of fresh bread, the sound of the villagers laughing and chatting as they went about their day. All the simple, beautiful things he had taken for granted. And he realized that to accept Frau Goden's offer would be to lose all of it, his humanity, his soul, the love and light of those he held dear. "No," Johann said, his voice trembling but resolute. "I won't do it. I won't be your slave." Frau Goden's expression darkened, her ethereal beauty twisting into something cold and menacing. The air around them seemed to grow heavier, the shadows deepening as her fury rose. "You dare defy me," she hissed, her voice low and dangerous. "Do you think you can resist me forever, Johann? I have marked you. You will never be free of me. Every night I will be there in your dreams, calling to you, drawing you closer to me. You can't escape what you've become." Johann stood his ground, though every instinct screamed at him to flee. "I'm not yours. I'll never be yours." Frau Goden's eyes flared with anger, and the cold intensified, biting into Johann's skin like needles of ice. The trees around them groaned and creaked, their branches bowing under the weight of her wrath. You think you're strong enough to resist me? To turn your back on the gift I offer, she spat, her voice rising in intensity. You are nothing, Johann, a fleeting speck of dust in the endless expanse of time. You will die, and all that you are will be forgotten. But with me you could be eternal. Johann felt the truth of her words like a knife to the heart. He was nothing compared to the ancient, dark power that stood before him. But as much as the fear clawed at him, as much as the darkness beckoned, he knew he could not surrender. If he did, he would lose everything that made him who he was, his love for Lise, his connection to the village, the very essence of his humanity. No, he repeated, his voice stronger this time. I would rather die 1,000 times as a human than live forever as your slave. For a moment there was silence, the air thick with tension as the two faced each other. Then, slowly the fury in Frau Goden's eyes began to fade, replaced by something colder, more calculating. Very well, Johann, she said, her voice now a soft, chilling whisper. You've made your choice, but remember this, I am patient. I can wait for as long as it takes. One day, when the fear of death grows too great, when the loneliness becomes unbearable, you will come to me, and when that day comes, I will be waiting. With those final ominous words, she began to fade into the shadows, her form dissolving into the night like mist. Johann watched her go, his heart pounding in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The darkness around him seemed to lighten, the oppressive weight lifting as Frau Goden vanished completely. He stood there for a long moment, shaken and trembling, before finally turning away from the forest and making his way back to the farmhouse. The cold night air stung his skin, but he welcomed it, grateful for the sharp reminder that he was still alive, still human. As he reached the farmhouse, the first light of dawn was beginning to break over the horizon, casting a soft golden glow across the snow-covered landscape. Johann paused at the door, looking out at the village, at the familiar, comforting sight of smoke rising from the chimneys, the sound of roosters crowing in the distance. He knew that he had been forever changed by his encounter with Frau Goden, that the darkness she had planted within him would always be there, lurking at the edges of his mind. But for now he was free. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him, and made his way to the small bed that had been his since childhood. Lise was still asleep, her face peaceful and untroubled. Johann watched her for a moment, his heart swelling with a fierce, protective love. He knew that he would do anything to keep her safe, to shield her from the darkness that had nearly consumed him. As he lay down beside her, exhaustion finally overtook him, and he drifted off into a deep, dreamless sleep. But even as he slept, a part of him remained vigilant, aware that the battle was far from over, that the darkness was still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike. And as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the window, Johann knew that he would be ready when that day came. He had faced the darkness and had come out the other side. And though the road ahead would be long and difficult, he was determined to walk it, no matter where it might lead. As the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, Johann's life resumed a semblance of normalcy, but the shadow of Frau Goden never truly left him. He went about his daily tasks, his hands busy with work, but his mind was never at ease. The villagers whispered about him when they thought he wasn't listening, their eyes filled with a mix of pity and fear. They knew something was different about him, something that no amount of warmth or sunlight could drive away. Lies ever vigilant, watched her brother with a growing sense of dread. She could see the toll the encounter with Frau Goden had taken on him, how the darkness had wormed its way into his heart, slowly eroding the man he once was. His once bright and joyful spirit had dimmed, replaced by a quiet, brooding resolve that she didn't fully understand. But she didn't need to understand to know that something was terribly wrong. One cold, moonless night, as the wind howled outside and the trees groaned under the weight of the snow, Johann lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling. Sleep had become a distant memory, something that eluded him no matter how tired he was. Every time he closed his eyes, he could feel Frau Goden waiting for him. In the darkness, her presence a constant, suffocating weight on his soul. He knew she was right. No matter how much he resisted, no matter how strong his resolve, she would always be there, waiting for the moment when his defenses would weaken. And when that moment came, she would claim him, body and soul. But it wasn't his own fate that worried him the most. It was Lies. He could see the worry in her eyes, the fear that she tried so hard to hide. He knew that if Frau Goden couldn't have him, she would come for Lies. She was relentless, and she would do anything to get what she wanted. As the hours ticked by, Johann made a decision. It was the hardest decision he had ever made, but it was the only one that made sense. If he couldn't escape Frau Goden, if he couldn't save himself, then he would do the one thing he could. He would protect his sister, even if it meant giving up everything. He rose quietly from his bed, careful not to wake Lies, who slept peacefully beside him. The farmhouse was dark and cold, the fire in the hearth reduced to a pile of glowing embers. Johann dressed quickly, his hands shaking with the cold and the weight of what he was about to do. He took one last look at Lies, his heart heavy with sorrow and love. He bent down and placed a gentle kiss on her forehead, whispering a soft farewell. "I'm sorry," he breathed, his voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry." Without another word, Johann turned and left the farmhouse, stepping out into the bitter cold of the night. The village was silent, the houses dark, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The wind whipped around him, biting at his skin. but he barely felt it. His mind was focused on one thing, and one thing only, Frau Goden. He made his way to the edge of the forest, the place where he had last seen her, his footsteps crunching in the snow. The trees loomed before him, dark and foreboding, but he didn't hesitate. He knew she was there, waiting for him, as she had been every night since their first encounter. As he stepped into the shadows of the forest, the air around him grew colder, the darkness thicker. He could feel her presence, a chill that seeped into his bones, as if the very essence of the forest had come alive with her power. Johann, her voice whispered through the trees, soft and seductive, "You've come back to me." He stopped, his breath visible in the cold air, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew this was it, the point of no return. He had made his choice, and now there was no turning back. "I'm here," he said, his voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at him. "But before I go with you, I want your word that you'll leave Liza alone. You'll never harm her, never touch her, never enter her dreams." There was a moment of silence, the air thick with anticipation. Then, slowly, Frau Goden stepped out of the shadows, her form as beautiful and terrifying as ever. Her eyes glowed with an eerie, otherworldly light, and her lips curled into a cold smile. "You would bargain with me, Johann?" she asked, her voice filled with a mocking amusement. "Do you think you have anything to offer that would sway me?" Johann's jaw tightened, his resolve hardening. "You want me, don't you? That's what you've been after all this time. I'm offering myself to you willingly, but only if you promise to leave Liza alone." Frau Goden studied him for a long moment, her eyes narrowing, as if considering his words. Then, slowly she nodded. "Very well, Johann, I accept your bargain. Your sister will be safe from me, as long as you come with me willingly." The relief that washed over Johann was almost enough to bring him to his knees. It was done. He had secured Lisa's safety, but the price he was about to pay was one he could never undo. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. "Then take me," he said, his voice filled with grim determination. "I'm yours." Frau Goden's smile widened, and she stepped closer, her cold hand reaching out to touch his cheek. Johann shuddered at the icy contact, but he didn't pull away. He had made his choice, and now he had to live with it, or rather, exist with it. "Come, Johann," she whispered, her voice like the wind through the trees. "Your new life awaits." With a final sorrowful glance at the village, Johann allowed himself to be led deeper into the forest, the darkness closing in around him like a shroud. He could feel the last remnants of his old life slipping away, the warmth of the farmhouse, the laughter of the villagers, Lisa's loving smile, all fading into the distance. As they walked deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around them. the path growing darker and more twisted with every step, that Johann no longer felt fear. There was only a cold, numb acceptance, a resignation to his fate. And as the last traces of light disappeared, leaving nothing but the dark, eternal night, Johann knew that he had done the right thing. He had saved lies. He had protected her from the darkness that had nearly consumed him. And that, at least, was something. In the depths of the forest, where the shadows whispered secrets older than time, Frau Goden led Johann to a place where no light could ever reach. And there, in the heart of the darkness, she claimed him, body and soul, as her own. The village of Altwald never saw Johann again. But every now and then, when the wind howled through the trees and the moon was hidden behind clouds, the villagers would speak of a shadow that moved through the forest, of a figure glimpsed in the darkness, tall and pale, with eyes that glowed like the ghostly light of the moon. And they would shiver, pulling their cloaks tighter around them, as they whispered the name of Frau Goden, the ancient, terrible force that had taken one of their own. But lies, though her heart was broken and her soul weighed down with grief, would always smile sadly and shake her head, knowing that Johann had made the ultimate sacrifice to protect her. And so the legend of Frau Goden lived on, whispered from one generation to the next, a reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond the edge of the forest, waiting for those who were brave or foolish enough to venture into its depths. And so, dear listener, our journey through the shadows draws to a close. We've walked the twisted paths of Altwald, felt the cold breath of ancient secrets upon our necks, and witnessed the price of a soul claimed by darkness. But the night, as you well know, never truly ends. It lingers just beyond the light, waiting for those who dare to listen, to feel, to dream. As you return to the warmth of your world, remember the tale of Johann and Frau Goden. Let it haunt the edges of your thoughts, a reminder that the shadows are always there, watching, waiting. And should you crave another journey into the unknown, another tale to send a chill through your bones, you need only return. Before you leave, do not forget to subscribe and like, for these gestures are the keys that unlock more doors to the stories that dwell in the dark. Until next time, I'll be here waiting, just as the night waits for the sun to set. Until we meet again in the place where shadows reign.